Between 1850 and 1914, over 40 million people immigrated to the USA due to something called the open door policy, which was put in place in the late 19th century. By 1910, a third of the population of the 12 largest cities in the USA were immigrants, with another third being children of immigrants. And by 1914, there were more Italians in New York City than there were in Naples. The open door policy permitted almost unrestricted immigration to the USA, and the number of immigrants increased year on year after the turn of the 20th century, as a huge number of people came from all over the globe, especially from European countries. There were a huge number of reasons people wanted to move to the USA, and not all immigrants were the same. Some were influenced by push factors, factors that made people want to leave their own countries, and some were influenced by pull factors, reasons people were attracted to the USA. Some of the main push factors were that people wanted to escape their own country, either due to poverty or persecution, whether this be political, economic, or religious. They didn't feel it was safe for them to stay there. On the other hand, there were many pull factors, mainly centred around the idea of creating a better life and going to a country of opportunity, as it was often described. For example, people were pulled in by the thought of owning land, as there was a plentiful supply, and the promise of a country which was tolerant of all faiths and religions, so they could practice safely, without fear of harm. America was described as a melting pot of ethnicities and religions, which was very attractive to people who felt outcast at home. Around 70% of immigrants came over by boat and landed at Ellis Island off the coast of New York, which saw over 5,000 people a day during busy periods trying to register for their new lives. Although it did briefly get the nickname Isle of Tears, as 2% of people were rejected for being unhealthy or uneducated. Unfortunately, the land of opportunity didn't actually provide opportunity for everyone, and lots of immigrants found themselves living in urban ghettos and being blamed for a variety of issues across the country, such as crime and drunkenness, which led to them being the victims of a lot of violent racism in the 1920s. Even immigrants who came from poverty struggled, as they were used to an outdoorsy life, not one where themselves and their children were forced inside to work in factories. In the late 19th and early 20th century, immigrants found themselves providing cheap labour and still facing growing hostility from xenophobic Americans, who accused them of taking their jobs for lower wages in a time of mass unemployment and increasing demand for already scarce housing, increasing the prices. Strikes were very common in this period, and immigrants became central to these, stepping in as strike breakers when American workers walked out, as they were so desperate for work they would accept very low wages. Employers exploited this, weakening strikes and the power of unions, causing resentment and hostility from American workers. This reached a peak after 1917, when a communist revolution broke out in Russia. Many Americans were scared the same thing would happen in the USA, and a period called the Red Scare began. This led to increased animosity towards immigrants, as many Americans were scared they would spread communist ideals, even though most of them weren't actually entirely sure what communism was. There was an increase in isolationism, where people are more worried about their own country than the state of the world, which boosted these concerns, especially after World War I. Restrictions started to be put in place to limit immigration, starting with the 1917 Literacy Test Act, which made passing a literacy test a requirement for entering the country. Next, the 1921 Emergency Quota Act limited annual immigration from each country to 3% of that nationality's US population, based on the 1910 census. This favoured Northern and Western Europeans while discriminating against newer arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe. In 1924, the National Origins Act tightened quotas to 2% using the 1890 census, further excluding groups that were deemed undesirable. Here is an example of the numbers of immigrants allowed in. As you can see, it massively impacted Southern and Eastern Europeans, who were often from poorer or more disadvantaged backgrounds. In 1929, immigration was firmly capped at 150,000 per year, prioritising skilled and educated migrants, especially from Northern Europe. However, despite these restrictions, migration from nearby countries continued largely unchecked. Mexican immigration in particular jumped up, with California's Mexican population quadrupling in the 1920s. The quota system remained until the 1960s, when US immigration policy finally shifted towards fairness. The Red Scare was a massive part of life in the USA in the 1920s, but it didn't appear out of nowhere, with a series of events fueling the fire, beginning with the Communist Revolution in Russia in 1917. Although communists made up less than 0.1% of the population, suspicion of Eastern European immigrants grew, fueling xenophobia and increasing the restrictive immigration laws I mentioned previously. In 1919, there was an anarchist bombing at Attorney General Palmer's home, which led to the beginning of the Palmer Raids. Led by J. Edgar Hoover, these raids targeted radicals in 33 cities. Around 6,000 people were arrested, often without warrants, and hundreds of immigrants were deported, despite little evidence of real threats. In September 1920, fear only grew, after a bomb exploded on Wall Street, killing 38 people. The climate of fear came to a peak, however, in the infamous Sacco and Vanzetti case. On the 15th of April 1920, two men, Bardelli and Parmenta, were murdered in South Braintree, Massachusetts. Eyewitnesses described the attackers as olive-skinned foreigners, and Sacco and Vanzetti were immediately accused, as they were Italian immigrants and known anarchists. Judge Thayer, who was in charge of their trial, was openly biased and hostile towards them, using slurs and prejudiced language when referring to them. Despite 875 potential jurors being screened, impartiality was scarce, and the final jury declared them guilty after only 1 day of deliberation in a very complex case. The evidence was deeply contested. While 61 witnesses identified them, 107 provided alibis, but many were dismissed due to speaking poor English. Sacco's pistol was linked to the crime, but the bullets didn't match, and both men were legally carrying their firearms due to fear of being attacked after the Palmer raids. Much of the prosecution's case relied on circumstantial evidence, such as Sacco's friends being known anarchists and the attackers having Italian accents. Appeals and protests failed, and despite a man named Medeiros admitting to committing the crime in 1925, they were executed in 1927 as victims of xenophobia and prejudice during the Red Scare. The Red Scare revealed deep anxieties in post-war America, particularly a fear of communism. Sacco and Vanzetti's case, later recognised as a miscarriage of justice, symbolised how fear and prejudice could undermine democracy.